All right, welcome to Chapter 14, Water Pollution. Just as a reminder, we did several of these slides in the Chapter 14 up to sanitation systems or waste management systems, but I'm going to review those slides as we go along. So, Water Pollution, Chapter 14. Here we go. All right, just as a point of reference, water pollution is anything that will contaminate groundwater, but primarily we're going to be looking at human sewage and livestock within this chapter 14 and its impact it has on the environment. Two important things that we need to be able to distinguish between is point source pollution and non-point source pollution. All right, so point source is something that you can directly see and pinpoint as a source of pollution in that location. For instance, someone has a sewage septic tank and it is leaking into Beaver Dam Creek, and you're in a boat and you notice that the actual sewage is seeping into the creek. That would be a point source. Non-point source pollution would be all of the houses on the Great South Bay. They're fertilizing their property. The fertilizer is then going to sort of run down into the water table and then out into Great South Bay, polluting it, leading to eutrophication. Right, and that would be non-point because we can't pinpoint a specific house that's actually taking care of it. Right, so two important words that you're able to actually take care of here or identify at the very first. All right, we went over this, oxygen demand. So anytime we have a spike in the demand for oxygen, you have a spike in the life that would be in an area, and that could potentially lead to eutrophication or an algae bloom, for instance. Nutrient release would be the over-release of nutrients into the environment. Could be through fertilizer overuse. It could be, if we remember the movie that we watched, the chicken farms would have massive piles of waste from the chickens, and that waste then would release the nitrogen and phosphorus into the environment, and that would slowly leak into the Chesapeake Bay, for example. Disease-causing organisms, and we're looking here at things that would potentially harm human life. All right, we'll get to that at the end of the chapter. Just as a review, anytime we go out into the environment, biological demand for oxygen is going to be measured, right? So there should sort of be a baseline amount of oxygen that is being consumed by organisms naturally in the environment. If there's a spike in that level where the demand is much, much higher, that means something is not right or out of balance in the environment, where you have an excessive amount of nutrients in the environment and you have an explosion of life, thereby absorbing or demanding more oxygen. Anytime you have this explosion of life, you're always going to eventually lead to a dead zone in our aquatic system. Right, and so this can occur in any body of water, but for us, very specifically here on Long Island, we have the usual yearly cycle of eutrophication in our Great South Bay, and that is because we are introducing a tremendous amount of fertilizers from the farms that we have here on Long Island, and everybody wanting to beautify their landscape, they're over-fertilizing their lawns, for instance, right? And then in that water, basically, if you remember from the video, it literally is a dead zone. And when they mean dead zone, they mean there is no life present. And that's because everything has basically absorbed the oxygen so fast out of the environment that it basically suffocates everything or kills things. Moving on. All right, we have two terms here, eutrophication. I've already used this a couple times while we've gone over the first couple slides. And basically, it's a place where nutrients are sort of exploding or increasing at a rapid level in any body of water. It could be a lake upstate New York, or it could be the Great South Bay, as I'm giving the example here, because it's local to us. Cultural eutrophication really specifically results from the anthropogenic release of that nutrient into the environment. So anthropogenic is human-caused, as we remember. All right, and so one example, obviously, that I've given you already would be the release or the overuse of fertilizer in the environment, and then we have a cultural eutrophication of those bodies of water. All right, so here we have fertilizers as the example. All right, moving on. All right, disease-causing organisms, and this is primarily an issue Not so much in the United States because we use a sanitary sort of sewer system, and it's odd to use the word sanitary because sanitary should mean sterilized or clean, but in this case we're separating out our waste from our main bodies of water that we potentially would be drinking from. This is not always the case around the world. Not all places around the world have a proper sewage system that isolates that stuff from our drinking water. A lot of times that water that is being flushed down a toilet or down a sink will eventually be put back right back into the water that they're actually taking their drinking water or bathing water from. All right, and that potentially leads to having a number of pathogens that could be present in that water, be it bacterial or it could actually be worms. All right, and here at the very bottom we have several things that could potentially be passed in contaminated water. Cholera, which you would think would be basically almost extinct in the world, but it is actually pretty common and has seen a rise actually um, in the United States, again on the west coast of the United States, and including typhoid fever has been actually identified as an issue in San Francisco prior to the craziness that is going on right now. Stomach flu is just a basic your bacterial or your bug as we'll call them, basically makes you ill, and then hepatitis is a bloodborne disease that no one should actually worry about, but we do have several vaccines which will actually protect you against that. Not all hepatitis are vaccinated for, but the ones that are most common would be. All right, an indicator species that we have here is basically a disease-causing pathogen that is present or not. And then one thing we'll look for very specifically when we're relating to human sort of pathogen is fecal chloroform bacteria, and then obviously the fecal we went over is human waste products. All right, so if we have a spike in this fecal chloroform bacteria, then we have potentially a release of waste products from human source into the environment, like that example I gave back at the beginning, where a cesspool was overflowing and then leaking into the Great South Bay, and then we see a spike, or excuse me, the Beaver Dam Creek, where we will eventually, hopefully, be able to get back down to observe the environment. All right, so fecal chloroform bacteria will be something that we potentially will sort of test for when and if we're able to get back there. All right, so we went over this in class. We watched a video very specifically about sewage treatment plants. If you did not see the video, I'll find it again, and I'll be sure to post it up on Google Classroom so that you can watch it. It was potentially a little bit long and obviously a little dry, but it really does a very good job of explaining that. And like I said on the AP test, 2 years ago it was, they very specifically asked for how this functions. All right, septic systems is something that is on your personal property. All right, and so we'll go over that really quickly. The difference between this is on home, and this is on your property somewhere that is going to be collecting the bulk of the runoff. All right, sludge is that solid waste material that is eventually going to be collected in your first tank, and then in some cases has to be actually pumped out because of bacterial colonies that are in your septic system aren't gobbling up that waste faster than you're putting it into it. Seepage is stuff that basically is, excuse me, septage is something that is sort of like the clear water that the solid waste that sludges basically fall into the bottom, and then the floating stuff, the fresh material, paper, and other human wastes would be at the top. And a leach field we do not have here on Long Island, like I had mentioned, but if you go up into sort of Pennsylvania, they would have leaching fields. All right, and so the picture that we have here is an example of the predominantly most of what septic systems look like in the United States. You have your tube that comes out, and here it's catching everything from your sink, bathrooms, tubs, whatever it's going to be, gets into your septic tank. It's a large cement sort of catch, basically. Here they're showing two tops, but in here on Long Island we only have usually one large manhole cover that would be showing or visible, so for them to get in to be able to pump. All the waste goes in there. You have your settling out. You have your mixing in this environment where the paper products and human waste are being broken down. particularly by the bacteria in there, and then you have an overflow. And that overflow then will go out, and here in this instance, the leach field, all right, and then the leach field is basically going to spread that water out so it's not concentrated as it's going down into the environment, all right? So it goes down into the environment and then refilters that water nice and clean. We went over sewage treatment plants. I highly suggest that you, again, go back and watch that video, but they're controlled by municipalities. So townships and or cities or counties, in the case of Nassau County, runs these facilities. Same with Suffolk. All right, and so here, figure 41, excuse me, wait until that disappears. Figure 41.6. All right, and so it gives you a basic breakdown of how this is working. Make sure that you know these steps individually, what's happening here. So all your waste product is going into your first facility. You have your screens that are catching the large stuff that will be trucked off to a waste facility. You have your primary facility, which is basically getting out the very large waste products before it's being treated with anything. Again, these things are being brought, as you see here, the truck is being brought to a dump to be disposed of. In some cases, it's actually brought to a facility and burned. Moving on to your secondary treatment facility here. Secondary, or it's being bubbled with water. It's being bubbled with air, and that air is then sort of really to promote bacterial growth, and the bacteria are gobbling the waste product up, just like they would in your septic system in your house, except you do not have an air bubbling system. So, point of reference here. Suffolk County has been having issues with waste being penetrating into the water table that we're actually consuming from. So there has been suggestion that this sort of system be installed in or retrofitted, or any new facilities have sort of this secondary treatment tank installed where air is bubbled in, bacteria then are able to gobble that waste product up and do a better job of cleaning that waste water before it is put into the leach field, and that leachate is pushed out into the environment. Again, all that solid waste is going to be carried back into a landfill and then disposed of. Here you have several different methods that are used. In this case, they're showing that it is being treated for pathogens with ultraviolet light, and that is the cleanest way to do it. In some places in the world, chemicals are still used to actually clean it. You can say chemicals are used in our table water. They'll actually add a nominal amount of chlorine in some cases to clean the pipes, and or fluoride in some cases in the United States. All right, so this is the basic idea of a sewage treatment plant, and you definitely need to know how this works. All right, so we looked at that video talked about the chicken coops, and the chicken farms are actually having a tremendous amount of waste. Purdue, to give them at least some credit, did actually develop a method to take a lot of that abundance of chicken waste and sort of process it for use as a fertilizer and or for other uses in our country. All right, but in most cases you'll have a manure lagoon, and that's where all that waste product is being sort of catched and then not put anywhere particularly. It's basically going to evaporate off, and then that waste sort of nitrogen and phosphorus are going to absorb into the environment. In the case of the Chesapeake Bay, as the example is, the spike of phosphorus and nitrogen in the environment was intense enough to actually completely contaminate the watershed. All right, so here we're looking at more specifically other chemicals that would be put into the environment, probably through a manufacturing sense. All right. All right, so obviously we have a lot of concerns at BHS and without the school district for lead, right, as you know. So places you're not able to drink from are pipes and or faucets that are old enough that that lead is leaching into the water and making it potentially toxic for you. Even a very slight amount of lead above the legal limit could potentially cause harm to you. Arsenic, which is common in the natural environment, but also through human activities, particularly mining, will be released into the environment. And as we know, arsenic is a toxic chemical and could quickly kill anybody. Mercury obviously is a very bad thing. It's a heavy metal. Again, just like lead, once you're ingesting in your body, it does not get metabolized, which means it's going to be permanently within your body it's never going to be leaving. And that is an issue, particularly for young. It leads to developmental issues. Same with lead, leads to developmental issues, particularly within sort of brain development. All right, so it slows and or impedes or completely prohibits the natural development of an adolescent baby. Right, just gives you a picture of the concentration of arsenic, and you can see that some places in our country have a very, very high amount of it. Some people have a very low amount of it. Depends on just your natural geography and the types of minerals that are in the environment. Safe to say you should move to Hawaii because you look, there's no arsenic there, huh? Right, we look at mercury and its concentration around the world. Asia has most of it in its soils. North America has actually very, very little of it in our environment. So what's a good thing for us? Anytime we're talking about acids deposition, it means it's talking about either mine drainage, or basically, or not proper filtering of water, or runoff, which is settling and not really allowing sufficient runoff of the waste products that are building up in the earth, in the soils. And over time, as you have that acids rise, you'll actually have a decrease in the pH level, which means that it becomes lethal. You can particularly see this sort of thing happen if you have household plants and you don't water them frequently enough where the water will drain out of the pot, and allowing for an exchange of that water and decreasing of the acid concentration in that soil. You can add buffers to it. You can add bases to your soils to sort of counteract that, and you can buy those over the counter for your household plants. Farmers will actually do this as well. They'll try to maintain the pH of the soil, so if it is particularly low and the crop that they're growing does not sort of work well with it, they will add bases to their soil. All right. All right, and so here we have pharmaceuticals and hormones in our water, and this is what I mentioned in class briefly. The frequency and percentage of these things is increasing in our table water here on Long Island, particularly steroids. And you say, well, steroids it's not really for people that are building muscle. A lot of times in medication, steroids are used to better deliver that sort of chemical into the body. Non-prescription drugs, which would be over-the-counter drugs, um, like for instance acetaminophen, are being seen. Antibiotics, reproductive hormones, so both testosterone and estrogen are being found, human testosterone and estrogen being found in our water table at a nominal amount, and that's a significant issue. And then other prescription drugs that you would find either prescribed by the doctor or narcotics. All right, so these things are a major, major issue for us. We should never see any of these in our natural water supply. And here on Long Island, as our population sort of increases, more people are putting waste into the environment, which means the soil, the natural process of pulling all of those harmful chemicals out and sort of breaking them down naturally is not occurring fast enough because the supply of wastewater is into the ground too fast and it's not naturally sort of cleaning it. All right, so what was once probably the best water in the nation on here on Long Island has since fallen very much from the top down to the very bottom of quality of water. So Suffolk County, for example, Suffolk County Water Authority treats the water and filters it pretty aggressively before they actually pump it into the environment. So they will chemically treat it to try and neutralize many of these things that are found in the water. And a lot of times you'll actually taste that in the water supply. Sometimes it has very chemical based flavor, like chlorine. You taste a very nominal amount of chlorine in some facilities that you would go to. Most times the water that you taste, it has a metallic taste, and that's because it's the actual piping that you're actually tasting. The metals are sort of going into the water, and you're tasting that metal. Not always a bad thing, but in high doses that could potentially be bad as well. All right, so what will we do, or what could we do to actually sort of reduce these levels, bring all of this basically down to below the 20%? Really, you want it below 10 in any sort of situation, at least with some of these chemicals. Some of them, any amount is no good. All right. Well, we could definitely move in Suffolk County to a city sewer system where it goes to a treatment plant and that water is properly treated. Or we can actually go to a better filtering sort of septic system that Suffolk County has suggested, where it has multiple stages, and those multiple stages then will do a better job of gobbling and cleaning up that junk. Or as an add-on, not as a separate thing, we can actually try to stop using so much of this so that it's not being flushed down the toilet. Remember, any one of these things that you take in your body, you're not using 100%. So, for example, you're taking Tylenol, um, your body is going to metabolize some of it, and most of it is going to be just pushed out in your waste. So, when you go to the bathroom, you're actually releasing a good chunk of what you're taking in as a pill. And so, they'll give you an effective dose of the pill to try and maximize the amount of that particular, say, antibiotic that's being absorbed into your body over a given period of time. All right, military compounds are sort of a nasty group of chemicals that are basically being used, and here you're using the example of this perchlorates, and it's primarily used in rocket fuel, but perchlorates have been used in some chemicals that will actually be used as like an antifreeze to prevent freezing on an aircraft. All right, so these are what we're going to call life chemicals, things that are going to be in the environment no matter what, unless we physically remove the soil that was contaminated. It's never going away, and that's a real problem. All right, and so a very long time our military was not checked by, and for the most part still really isn't checked by, the same environmental controls that we have as a regular sort of folk in the United States. All right, and so they'll use things that are potentially very harmful to the environment. And here we're, in the example, we're using rocket fuel, very very bad for the environment. All right. Industrial compounds, and here you should be very, very familiar with PCBs. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, and they are basically used in plastics or a byproduct of manufacturing of plastics. All right, and so if we remember the water movie that we watched, these PCBs are basically potentially cancer causing in almost everything, and they cause a whole host of other sort of biochemical changes, endocrine system changes, so hormonal system changes in all organisms really. But here we're talking about humans particularly because we're worried about ourselves. That's humans basically being selfish as always. All right, and so there's been a real big push to cut back PCBs from being released in the environment so that we can better clean our bodies of water. All right, and so here we're going to look at oil pollution. We're getting towards the end of our chapter here. Oil pollution is a significant issue, and then what kind of remediation do we have for any kind of oil spill, for example, the BP oil spill, which I suggest you look up and watch some videos on. They have asked about that in the past. And oil release in our environment is always and probably for a pretty long time into the future will be a significant issue for us in our water systems. All right, and so petroleum products basically will hurt anytime there's a spill, really our marine sort of ecosystem. Those marine organisms, the fish, clams, oysters, shrimp, are going to be adversely affected. For example, when the BP oil spill occurred, um, you basically had shrimp that were stained black, oysters that would be pulled up and opened and they were black from the oil because these are fantastic. Oysters, particularly, are fantastic filter feeders. Mammals are going to be impacted. Fish will going to be getting killed. You'll have birds that are basically um, there that are going to be basically almost tarred. The oil gets in their feathers and prevents them from actually flying, and or it actually will suffocate them. All right, and so it's going to ultimately mess up the aquatic food chain. And remember, this aquatic food chain, we are part of it, meaning we are at the end in most cases consuming a lot of um, food out of our oceans. Right, the number one food supply source for protein on our planet is actually aquatic fish. And so if we're polluting it with this crap, this petroleum, then we're going to have a mess up in our food chain. All right. All right, and so here we're looking at sources of oil in our oceans, and here in this figure here, this is North America. Natural seepage occurs, so you see naturally the oil is getting into the environment. Consumption of petroleum, so some of it is being released into the environment just from that, transportation, and then extraction of petroleum. And then we look at the rest of the world, around the world, more or less follows the sort of the same pattern as we have here in the United States, in North America. All right, and how do we prevent it? So, any number of these oil companies, an example, BP Oil, had their disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, which is, mind you, still a sort of an environmental disaster still to this day. So how do we prevent it, contain it? All right, and so booms will be laid around the floating oil as much as possible, and then that floating oil is literally sucked off the surface of the ocean and then controlled. In some cases, containment is not possible. All right, we do not have enough booms, and/or the area is so vast that the oil is going to escape. Or remember, this containment with these booms, the water has to be particularly calm. So if you're out in the open water in the ocean, the water is never calm like it was if you went down to the creek and you looked at the water there. All right, so we would use chemicals, and the chemicals really are a dispersing agent, and that dispersing agent breaks that floating oil into smaller, tiny little droplets, and those tiny little droplets basically are meant to um, sort of fall to the ocean floor, or if they hit the shoreline, they're not in one massive clump, one massive oil slick. They're in small little sort of puddles that are easier to manage or clean up. Bacteria is something that is new on the sort of the list of cleaning methods that we would use to remediate an oil spill. This is particularly effective, right? So they'll go out and say the marshes of Louisiana, where oil was basically destroying the wetland. Um, they would spray the bacteria down, and the bacteria would then gobble up the oil for us and leave nothing sort of toxic behind. Once the oil is gone, the bacteria basically will die because there's no food source for them to eat. So a very effective means to actually do that, but sort of a costly method and not something that is easily done. In some places, don't even allow you to do that. You have to have special permissions. So they'll rely basically on containment, using these booms to actually do it and sucking up the oil that they possibly can. Um, Chemicals to actually break it up, and then there's another one that's not on here. So particularly in an instance of the BP, they actually lit the oil on fire to burn the oil up, and obviously that is going to have some dramatic issues besides polluting the environment. Yes, you're getting rid of the oil, but you're releasing a crazy amount of air pollution into the environment. All right, so non-chemical things that we're going to be talking about at the very end here, and the issues that are associated with it. All right, and so much of that solid waste includes garbage and sludge, and so for a very long time, New York was actually dumping garbage right into the ocean here in the United States, and really didn't end until for New York, I believe New York City into the late 80s. They were just taking their garbage, boating it out. I don't say dry, but boating it out on barges many miles offshore. Not deep enough where it's not going to be on the continental shelf. It was still on the continental shelf, and then that water garbage was just down there. So it's posed an issue now as we're decreasing the number of fish that are in our water. We're going to different areas and actually harvesting. People going to these areas, and as it turns out, some fishers are actually going out where they dump these large garbage patches. They are on charts. It's illegal to fish in that area, but people will still go there because they're trying to make a buck. And if they can fish where the fish are, they're going to go. All right, so that's a particular problem. Don't want to dump that um, garbage into our oceans. It's not unending. It is going to eventually wash up on our shores, which it did, and that's really why they started to curtail doing this or ending it in the early 80s in the United States, because we started to see more biohazard wastes, needles, and all sorts of hospital garbage sort of washing up. All right, and this you basically should definitely know. I've had you do this a couple times. Please understand. Please understand what the water Clean Water Act, what the Safe Drinking Water Act. They are not interrelated. They do both sort of end game. This is to keep our bodies of water clean. This is to ensure that you are getting fresh water at the tap. Uh, be mindful, though, that companies like Nestle or Pepsi or any of those big companies, Coke, they are not held to the same standards that the Safe Drinking Water Act holds the government to. And in most cases, if you remember in the movie for Poland Spring, they don't even have to test that water. They do test the water. They do it just because they want to say they did it, but they're not routinely doing it. And they don't even have to provide that information to the public or the government. And potentially, unless there's a, like sort of a major issue, then obviously the government potentially will demand that stuff from them. All right, so they will do it, but it's been shown that in some cases independently, that the bottled water that you're buying can contain higher levels of rat excrement. It has a crazy amount of plastic or um, toxins in it. It could contain mercury and lead at a higher level than is acceptable by legal limits in the United States. All right, so please know those two. All right, and so it goes over very clearly what it does. Right, protect and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, and recreational in our waterways. All right, so a means for us to be able to go to the beach and not have to worry about swimming in toxic sludge. And this is what it does. It holds corporations, it holds industry or manufacturing to a higher standard. But as we see, um, when there's a will, there's a way to circumvent this. And over the past couple decades, lobbyists have worked aggressively to sort of decrease the effectiveness. I was going to say water down, but that would be kind of cheeky. But it would decrease the effectiveness in the United States, and it has seen a decrease in its effectiveness where it's not as aggressively sort of enforced in the United States. And then here we have Safe Drinking Water Act, which directly you should be familiar with the maximum contaminant levels, particularly here for us with lead. You should look up and see what the EPA holds as the maximum level, and you'll be shocked to see that there's lead still in our water, in our drinking water, even probably in your house, at a very, very low level. And that's because it's deemed that at under a certain level it's not toxic. But that's still not a safe thing to judge by. We should never have to worry about our water having levels that are near or exceeding that. And that's what our Safe Drinking Water Act does for us. It prevents or establishes rules for municipalities to have to control the water. And as a point, I really, really do think that the government, the federal government, should start to hold corporations much, much more accountable to the Safe Drinking Water Act as well. They shouldn't just be left to their own device and saying, "Oh, well, maybe we'll do it, but we're not maybe not doing it because it costs too much." That's just not acceptable. All right. All right, and so here you have your lists of different things that could be potentially found in the environment, the parts per billion at which you can find them, and for an example here, in mercury, an inorganic compound which is going to basically stay in your body permanently. 2 parts per billion. Above that would be dangerous. So in some places in the country, they do still have a little bit of mercury in the environment, but a little is not going to potentially impact you. But if you're having it a lot over a long period of time, a lifetime, and it's close to this level here of 2, it could be a real problem for you. All right. So here are leading causes of or sources of impaired waterways, and what they mean by that is just polluted waterways. We have streams and rivers, and we're looking at sort of the things that could be in there, and then here they're showing you the things that will impact that environment. Lakes, ponds, this is basically sort of an issue because it is not sort of flowing, so this is going to build up over time. And then where you get that from, here on Long Island, very, very much agriculture is an issue for us when it comes to eutrophication of our water. So in the Great South Bay would be a great example of that. Basin estuaries, even though they do have a good bout of mixing, we have to worry about eutrophication and any one of those sort of contaminants. remember, just because it's not listed, say down here, PCBs can be and have been found to be significantly higher in our bays and estuaries. Here in Long Island, there was a really the Great South Bay. There was a really big point of time in the late 70s where it was just not a place you'd want to go. You would not want to go in there to fish and or swim because it was so polluted with PCBs and other stuff that was in the environment that we were basically dumping there. All right, so these are all interchangeable. They can actually be there. You can find bacterial sort of pathogens in the lakes that are here on Long Island. It does not mean that it is limited to just streams and rivers. All right, just keep that in mind, please. All right, I believe that is, yes, I believe that is it for chapter 14. Yes. If you have any questions about what you're seeing here, then please do send a message or remind, and I will try and get back to you. Again, you have an assignment that's posted up to Google Classroom, which asks you to copy these notes down and then take pictures of them with your phone and then post them back up onto that Google Slides and then submit that Google Slides through Google Classroom for me so I know that you at least are looking at it and you're aware of it and hopefully you have questions for me that I can ask. All right, till next chapter.